My name is Brad Piazza. I'm the Dean of the School of Business at the college, and I'm thrilled to see a classroom full of our business students here today. So thank you to all of you who have taken time out of your day to come to this, and thank you to the faculty who are sacrificing some class time to listen to a talk from a national speaker about our country's economic debt. Throughout your classes, you're told about the value of networks and professional relationships, and regardless of what program you're into, that holds very true. And this event and the whole program that we have that begins today and ends at about 8 p.m. tonight is a direct result of our network. One of our business partners for the School of Business was approached by the Concord Coalition to see if there was a way that this message about the debt could be delivered in Wisconsin, and Dina Fliss, the president of Global View Capital Management, called me and said, Brad, do you have interest in hosting this event at your college and co-hosting this with me? And absolutely was the answer that I gave her, because this is an opportunity for us to expose our students to a message that we don't necessarily think about and hear about on a daily basis. And this evening, we'll have about 220 members from the community who will be coming to the campus to hear this message as well. I want to start by thanking Russ Roberts, Noel, Joachim, Sarah Imhoff, and Rachel Heisling for all the work that they did in bringing this event to us. Sarah's with the Concord Coalition, Sarah, and Rachel is with the Fix the Debt organization. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Paul Stebbins. He's a graduate of Georgetown University and served as a CEO of World Fuel Services Corporation from July 2002 to January 2012, and became the executive chairman in January of 2012. In May 2014, he retired as chairman emeritus and serves as a member of the board of directors. A lifelong entrepreneur, he and his partner Mike Kasbar founded TransTech Services in New York in 1985 and sold their company to World Fuel in 1995. Today, World Fuel has 107 offices in 36 countries and ranks 74 on the 2013 Fortune 500. Mr. Stebbins has authorized numerous industry articles and lectured frequently around the world on fuel procurement, strategy, derivatives, fuel quality, entrepreneurship, and general business. More recently, has given numerous talks around the country on the national debt and the challenges of political dysfunction. He is a participant in the Herbert A. Wertheim Lecture Series at Florida International University's Graduate School of Business. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Stebbins.
So there's a great turnout. Thank you very much for all being here. Let me, before we kind of dive into this, how many of you have student debt? Okay, wanted to check that. How many of you believe that our political system is working in the most optimal fashion you might imagine? Okay, I'm just trying to level set the field here, right? So anyway, I'm Paul Stebbins. I am, you know, there's a resume there, but I'm an entrepreneur. Basically, I'm a business. In fact, I'm living proof that a government major out of Georgetown could actually get a job. I can tell you that when I got out of school, government majors were not being hired, and I ended up wandering into business. But I'm also, unlike many of you who are here, I applied to business schools not just once, but twice, and I got rejected both times. So I did what every self-respecting reject does. I said, okay, I'll show you, I'm going to start a business. So I never did go to business school, and I kind of wish I did that. Now, my wife, on the other hand, was the smart one. She went to business school, and she majored in accounting. So I have a special interest in you accounting people out there. I know there are a few of you. Don't duck down your seats. Because a lot of what we're going to talk about today does have to do with business and the accounting and how we kind of run our national finances. You might wonder why you should even care about something as brain-numbing as the national debt. But I can tell you, I have occasion, I sit on a thing called the Energy Security Leadership Council. And on that council is a guy named Admiral Mullen. And Admiral Mullen is the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of our country. And I asked him in sort of a moment of just hanging out before a panel discussion, I said, what would you rank as the most serious threats to the long-term viability of the United States? And he said, oh, that's easy. I'll give you 4, and I'll rank them. Number 1, K through 12 education. Pretty interesting. Number 2, national debt. Number 3, energy independence, and by that he meant our terrible addiction to oil and how we should reduce our dependency on that. But he also meant fresh water and food supply chains. And the 4th thing he mentioned was political dysfunction. That those were the most serious threats, not China, not ISIL, not, cyber attacks, but those 4 things could be the undoing of our country. That kind of got my attention. I thought that was a very interesting response. Today we're going to talk about 2 of those. We're going to talk about the national debt and why it's important, and we're going to talk about political dysfunction because they are related, because we have one of these strange chicken eggs where we know a lot about how to fix one, but we can't get to it because of the other. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. So what is the debt? Now you got this card. I was very interested. Rachel must have been doing the, Sarah, somebody did the advanced work because you have a nifty little post out here. Well, the debt is, think about $1 a second for 397,000 years. $1 a second for 397,000 years is our national debt. That's a lot of debt. Our net debt, so-called, which is the stuff that we basically owe the outside markets, is about close to 13 trillion now, $12,752 billion. And the gross debt, if you add all the stuff we technically just owe ourselves, it's about 17. And then when you get into this wild world, you accountants will love this, the unfunded liabilities into the future gets to be a really, really large number. Well, you say, okay, so it's a big number. I mean, we're a big country, we got a huge economy, why would it matter? Well, to put that in a little bit of perspective, right now our debt to our GDP, and that's sort of the number that calculates the economy at large, is about 72%. So our debt to our GDP is 72% right now. If you look at the historical average over the history of the United States, that runs somewhere around 36, 37% historically throughout the history of the country. After World War II, it was at its highest rate ever at 108% of debt to our GDP. So we're at 72 today. As recently as 2007, we were at about 35% debt to GDP. So with the recession, a couple of wars, tax cuts, a lot of other stuff, that number's grown extremely. So we've gone from 35 to 72 just since 2007, right? But here's the scary part. In the next 10 years, that could very well be close to 100% of GDP. If you leave it alone and you leave all of our national laws as is, we do not change anything, we leave everything on its current trajectory, by about 2050, you're looking at about twice the size of our economy. And if you leave it to about 2080, you're almost 3 times the size of our economy, debt to GDP. You say, well, how the hell could that be? Those are really huge numbers. That trajectory doesn't make any sense. How do we get there? So the first thing is you have to understand this has happened over a long period of time. And yes, we are an exceptionally strong economy, but to put that in perspective, after World War II, the United States was 50% of the world's GDP. We had an enormously powerful position in the world economy. Today, we're about 24%. And after World War II, remarkably, both parties of Congress, Democrats, Republicans, everybody, all the way through Eisenhower, all the way through Kennedy, all the way through Johnson, decided that balancing the budget and reducing our debt was a very important bipartisan national priority. And it wasn't until about 2000 that this number begins to really start rocketing up again. So the reason it's important is because if you have this national debt, it begins to crowd out your future. And you are the most precious natural resource that the United States has, which is the next generation of our country. We've already done our damage. Some of us are trying to help it, but the fact remains we're not leaving you a very good legacy at this point. So the generational inequity, we talk a lot in this country about inequality today, what it means to be sort of on the wrong side of that spectrum, right? Where the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer, and it's tough. It's tough to get out of school with a lot of debt. It's tough to get a job. It's tough to compete in an economy where you've got China, Brazil, all this stuff going on. You've seen the problems in the global economy. You hear about it in your classes, and you're living it real time, because I'm sure many of you work and have jobs. You're not just doing this, and you live in the real world. The real world is not easy right now. So many of you are probably asking, what's your piece of the American dream? How do you get to be part of that? How do you get to be a Paul Stebbins who started with nothing and went to school? And I was a miner. I worked underground in a mine. I drove lumber trucks. I was a bartender. I was a waiter. I was many different things that got me through school, into a job, and into business. I didn't have the grad degree, and it wasn't easy. But things were different then, and it's not so easy for you today. So why is the debt important? If that number continues to grow, we begin to crowd out all of our competitive viability in the world, because you're competing with the federal government, and that national debt is competing in your life for productivity. So what does that mean? What are the drivers of this debt? There are a couple of big ones, and you've heard a lot about this in the newspaper. Some of you may have been following things like the Simpson-Bowles Commission of a couple of years ago. These are things where you've had very high-profile fights between the President of the United States, the Speaker of the House, the so-called grand bargains. Are we going to negotiate spending and tax reform? You've heard lots of political noise about no taxes whatsoever, don't raise taxes. You've heard other people say that's crazy, it's not about the taxes, it's about spending, we got to lower spending. All of this is the noise that you probably get bombarded. If you're like most Americans in the country, you tune it out. You're sick of it. You can't stand it. It's a lot of noise and a lot of screaming, and nobody seems to have sort of a rational conversation about how you fix this thing. So, but let's talk a little bit about what actually drives this thing called the $12 trillion net debt. So part of it is if you look at the budget, and this gets into the confusion, and those of you who are in the econ accounting classes will know, there's a big difference between our national debt issue, which is that $12 trillion number, which is the dollar a second forever until the end of time, and then there's the deficit, and that refers to our annual budget process. And you've heard about Paul Ryan, you've heard about Patty Murray, you've heard about skirmishing on the Hill, fights between the Republicans and Democrats, all about the budget. Why can't we even get a budget? So the deficit issue is the year-to-year issue of how much money we brought in and how much money we spent. And is there a gap? And that goes up and down. So there's a lot of talk right now in the press about how we've done a pretty good job of getting the deficit down. Wasn't, but a couple of years ago, those deficits were running about $1 trillion a year. And now we're down to about 500 and 400, and they're hoping by next year we might even get that annual deficit, the gap, down to a couple of $100 billion. Wouldn't that be great? So there's a sense that, you know what, we finally got our act together, we're bringing that deficit down, our budget's looking a little better each year. But that's not what the debt's about. The debt's sitting over here saying, yeah, that's great, but even those gaps still add to the debt. And what happens in about 2017 or 2018 is all that stuff that we did short term to bring those deficits down, turn right around and start going back up again, which is why if you don't do anything, if you didn't change any single law today, that's when you get to 100% of debt to GDP, 200% debt to GDP, 300% debt to GDP by 2080. If we didn't do anything, if we left all the laws the same, nothing was changed, as is, status quo today, that's inevitable. And you'd say, well, why? Well, there are a couple of big drivers. One is entitlement spending, and that's the catch-all that basically refers to Social Security, heard about that, Medicare, Medicaid. Those are the big drivers of what we call our entitlements, and by entitlements we mean they're tied by law to mandatory escalation. They continue to grow into perpetuity, into the future. But there's a problem with that. We've got an aging population. So as our population gets older and more people enter those programs, there is a hugely growing burden on those programs that is not as well funded as it used to be. Now, there are a lot of structural problems with those programs that could be addressed. You've all been following healthcare. There's not a person in this room who hasn't heard something or read an article sometime, unless you are absolutely dead on planet Earth. If you haven't heard about Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act, you've heard a little bit about healthcare in the last couple of years. It is a major political issue. But underlying all that, beyond how we actually provide health insurance in this country, is this deeper issue of the long-term systemic support for the most vulnerable in our society that has been part of policy for a long time. And that would be the healthcare and Medicare. Now, the problem with healthcare is that we are the largest, most expensive healthcare in the world. And it is growing. If you think about 1980, healthcare as a part of our federal budget was about 10%. Well, in 2012, it was about 20%. And when you get to about 2030, it becomes 30%. And that's regardless of what happens with the ACA. Why? Because it's all these fundamentally, these social programs, the entitlement programs, are tied to natural escalation over time. And because nobody will touch those, we'll talk about the politics in a minute, nobody wants to touch those because that's a very dangerous and very hotly contested political issue. You can't have even an informed conversation without causing a lot of political noise. But those programs are designed to grow into perpetuity, and they continue to take up bigger and bigger parts of the budget every year. So when we talk about discretionary parts of the budget, the stuff that you have a choice on what to spend, and the non-discretionary, this falls into the non-discretionary, which is now getting closer and closer to 70% of the budget, where you don't have any control over it. It's tied by law, and it's just going to continue to escalate. But what that means is when you've got stuff tied by law that's escalating into perpetuity, what are you driving out of the discretionary side? All the stuff that makes us competitive, all the stuff that's our future as a society, all the stuff that I would consider sort of the responsible investments that any good society makes, which is infrastructure, R&D, education. These are all things that get marginalized as you end up with a fight. Now, many of you have heard over the last couple of years words like sequester. That's a weird word. It probably should be on the GMATs or something, but what the hell is a sequester? But the sequester was an effort in one of these great, battles to the edge of the brink between the Republicans and Democrats, where because we could not get our act together to have an informed conversation about sort of how to rationalize these long-term curves that are threatening to the economy, we basically said, look, if we can't get our act together, we're just going to automatically cut everything across the board without any particular discerning surgery. It'll just be a blunt instrument. We'll take a chainsaw out and we'll just cut half for defense and half for everything else. Well, I don't think any of you would run your lives that way, and Washington shouldn't either, but that's exactly what we did. So all these things that represent our long-term investments, if you will, in sort of the muscle of the country, the future of what really makes us productive, all gets cut bluntly as well, with not a lot of fine-tuning and not a lot of stuff. So healthcare is a huge driver and is one of the things that falls under this ever-increasing issue, and it's a real challenge. And it's representing a larger and larger piece of the GDP. And even though we've made some short-term gains, the ACA does look like it's beginning to save some near-term costs. There is calculus coming out of the research tanks in DC that suggests that. You haven't even begun to address the longer systemic underlying issues of Medicaid and Medicare. Now, groups like Simpson and Bowles did a lot of work on this. There's actually a lot of very good information about how you could restructure these to make them more viable over time, that are much more balanced. Paul Stebbins, corporate guy, it's okay for me to play a little more on Medicare. That's okay, that should happen. But you can't even have that conversation today because that falls under all new taxes, like new charges. But in any event, that's a very real part of one of the key drivers. Healthcare is a huge driver. Most expensive in the world relative to any other industrialized country, almost in some cases twice as much. And we aren't doing anything to address it because you can't touch it politically. Second thing is Social Security. And just to put that in healthcare, Medicare, which is developed into a couple different parts, even the Medicare, what they call the hospital trust fund, is insolvent in 2 years. In 2 years. I mean, this stuff is happening a lot faster than we realize. But again, can't touch it. We wrote our deficits. Let's leave it alone. That's the next guy's problem, kicking the can down the road. Social Security. Social Security is a big one. Now, when Franklin Roosevelt, many of you have heard about, you probably watched the TV thing, the Roosevelts, right? Well, Franklin Roosevelt, very smart guy when he did Social Security, because he said, you know what, we're going to have the Social Security net that takes the most vulnerable in society and allows them a long-term retirement program. And we will make that implemented at the age of 65. Now, back then, the average expectancy, life expectancy in the United States was 63. So Roosevelt was a pretty smart guy. You'll all be dead, you'll never need it, right? So he was pretty clever, a very good politician. But today, the average life expectancy is about 78. And for any of you in this room who have a grandparent, aunt, uncle, right, grandparents, they're living a lot longer. They're living into their 80s, they're living into their 90s, right? They're not dying at 78 according to some table that calculates an average statistic. They're hanging around a lot longer. And after a very tough recession, they're living in your house, or they're living in your basement, or you're living with them, right? Something's happened. It's not an easy thing. But that is a tough thing with Social Security, because if you think that in 1950 you had 16 working people, you had 16 people paying into the system for every person receiving. By 1960, that was down to 5. In 2013, it's 3. And by the year 2030, it's 2. Which means you're putting an enormous burden on a huge demographic fact of life. People are getting older, there are more of them, and there are fewer people working to contribute to it. Which means if we don't do anything to restructure that, to change the trajectory of Social Security, all of the Social Security trusts combined will be insolvent by 2033. 33, that's not very long from now. And that means everybody across the board, from grandma, from inner city LA, to Paul Stebbins, gets a 23% cut across the board. Now, that's not a very thoughtful way to do it, but that's what's going to happen if we don't do anything to address it near term. So there are ways to do it. The Simpson-Bowles Commission was very interesting, because one of the things they said about Social Security is they said if you took the Social Security and you moved the eligibility age by 1 year, not 5, not 10, 1 year, and you did it 40 years from now, right? Not next year, not the next decade, 40 years from now, you'd make it solvent for another 75 years. Now, we wouldn't want to rush anything, because that might be dangerous. So then they said if you moved it, then if you went another 50, if you moved it 1 more year, and you did that 15 years later, You'd fund it for another 75, because this is the law. All you econ people are going to understand this. All you accounting people get this thing. It's the law of doing something right now. It's like the ripple in the pond, or the tsunami, right? The small earthquake in the middle of the Pacific, by the time it hits Thailand, it's a 100-foot wave. That's what this is all about. This is what compounding value is all about. If you made those changes now, by the time you get there, they have a huge, enormous impact. But you've got to have the courage to make the changes now, which we don't currently have. We'll talk about that in a minute. So healthcare is a big one. Social Security is a big one. Military, pretty top of mind right now. Everybody's ready to pay. We got ISIL, we got chaos, we got anarchy in the world, we got Putin in Ukraine, we got all this stuff, right? Well, militaries are expensive, right? Our military budget, somewhere in the $500-600 billion a year range, is a huge, huge number, down from some of the war years when we were at full peak war in Afghanistan and Iraq, but still very significant. But just to put that in perspective, the next 15 largest military budgets in the world, including Russia and China, aggregate them all up, is about $550 billion. $550 billion. That's the next 15 largest military budgets in aggregate in the world. And we surpass even that. Which brings to bear questions about what is our commitment? What is the role of the United States in the world? And this is the future of all of us, right? And we can all read about the dangers of it, but you do have to make decisions about what is that fundamental role in the United States. Is it as efficient as it could be? I don't know. I don't know. It's not like there's a magic answer, but it does put in perspective what the budget is all about. And a big part of the budget also happens to be, interestingly enough, it's personnel related. So it's health care for them as well. Now you may remember when Patty Murray and Paul Ryan had their budgets and there was a big fight and they actually agreed on something and they saved $40 billion. One of the things they did was they changed the military pension to actually be the same as everybody else's pension, which is the cost of living escalator. They used to have a higher level. So they brought it back to the same level as everyone else, which seemed like a progressive thing to do. But I can tell you, and Rachel knows this in detail, and the people who worked on the debt, within a month, 98-1, the Senate had repealed it because it was so controversial. So even this amazing effort to get $40 billion, this is just a $40 billion savings that we were working on. Talk about, remember, we got $12 trillion sitting over here. We got budgets with gaps of anywhere from $200 billion to $1 trillion a couple years ago. Those are our gaps. And we were proud of ourselves for actually capturing $40 billion, which we then turned right around and gave back because it was politically hot. That shows you how difficult it is to get any of this stuff done. So the military is a big issue. Then we get to the killer. Killer is the interest. So all of you real estate finance people, you know about interest rates, right? And you econ people, all you people go to those, interest rates is a big deal. So right now, we paid in this last budget about $230 billion in interest on the national debt. Now we are in the lowest interest rate environment in history. Despite what you're reading now about the Fed starting to make some moves, starting to signal, make some noises. Maybe we'll release it. We don't want to stop the economic recovery. So the interest rates are very sensitive, and you see the stock market up and down, and everybody's a little concerned. So what is Janet Yellen going to do? What did Ben Bernanke used to do? What was QE, quantitative easing? I'm sure this is all stuff you've studied. But it's very germane to this issue because, for example, if we went to, does anybody think that we could go to 5% interest rates? I mean, does that seem crazy? I lived in the 70s when we had 17% interest rates, right? So this isn't unprecedented. If you go back about 50 years, 10%, 12%, these were not abnormal. If we even go to 5% interest rates, that $230 billion out of a $3.5 trillion budget goes to about $880 billion. Just like that, just on interest rates, right? So the sequester, which saved, even though it was blunt and stupid and not well thought out, from a deficit point of view, it saved $1.2 trillion over a long period of time. 1 percentage point interest rates in this country wipes that out. The entire sequester, everything you just saved, gone. 1 percentage point move. So we now look at a point where what happens when 6% of our budget, which is interest rates today, that's what the interest on the debt is, and all of a sudden we go back to a more normalized economy and that starts growing. At the current estimates from the Congressional Budget Office, which is by far considered the most neutral and most objective planner of these long-term statistics, interest rates all of a sudden go to about 20% of the budget, and then they get to about, by 2050, you're looking at 30% of our budget, is just interest on the debts, which means you're getting to a point where your non-discretionary entitlement program growth tied by law to escalation into perpetuity and interest combine to eat up the entire economy, which means there's zero discretionary dollars. Military spending is a discretionary item. It's not mandatory. So what do we do then, right? What do we do then? So interest is the killer. And for all of you who want to start a business, what really is tough about the debt issue is that if you have that kind of a threat coming down the road, how do you start a new business? How do you pay off your student loan? How do you get a mortgage? How do you get a car loan payment? This is Main Street. This isn't some theoretical 6-0 intellectual exercise between a bunch of people in political, fighting on Capitol Hill. This is a real Main Street issue that threatens every single one of our jobs. It also saps productivity, right? Because if you look at the statistics, this is, over the trajectory, this compression on our economy, this lingering overhang of these interest rates and the threat of that national debt burden is something that eats up productivity. And the estimates are over a lifetime of wages, over 40 years, could be anywhere between $250,000 and $300,000 in real dollars out of pocket from wages just because we haven't addressed the interest on the debt. That's pretty sober. So it's real. It's real. It's not some theoretical thing that we're going to instantly grow our way out of, but we'll talk about that in a minute. The last piece of this, a lot of that has to do with the spending trajectory. So the last piece is taxes. I'm sure all of you in this room have heard a lot about taxes. You've got Grover Norquist with no taxes. Don't, take the pledge. Don't ever raise a tax again. You've got very extreme feelings about taxes. You've got other people say, tax the rich. If we just tax those idiots in Wall Street, we'd have a lot more money. Or the Paul Stebbins of the world, we'd take all those one percenters and we take all that money, we would have enough, and then we wouldn't have all these problems. Well, here's the problem. Even if you took everybody with an income of $250,000 a year and above, and you taxed it 100%, 100%, take every bit of that money, you haven't even touched this issue. You haven't even got enough to solve the problem. So revenue reform, tax reform is a big deal. Right now, we have a $3.5 trillion budget. And if you looked at that as a spending graph, you would find that 24% of that is borrowing. Right? We borrow to actually make that gap. That's how you get to 3.5 trillion. You actually get about 3 trillion in real revenue. 500 billion is the borrowing. That's your that's the 6%. Anyway, now you have a situation where we've got a lot less revenue than we do outlay. And here's the other part that you've heard a lot about in the newspapers recently. Jack Lew, the Secretary of Treasury, things about inversions, corporate people going offshore, changing their tax structure, and they're avoiding taxes. You've heard a lot about this in the newspaper. So what this really is about is what they call tax expenditures. Tax expenditures is just another form of spending. It's just the other way around. The spending is that you've given it back in the form of what you would probably euphemistically have heard of as a loophole. So there is about $1.3 trillion in tax loopholes that get distributed back out. After we've alleged the tax, we then give all these loopholes and everything goes back out. Well, that's not a very efficient way to run the system. So what Simpson Bowles said, which was very interesting, was you've got a weird dilemma. They said, look, you got the highest corporate tax rate in the world now, which if you're a business person, and some of you are expecting to be corporate business people, perhaps, you are now competing in a global environment. But you got the highest corporate tax rate in the world. But you're also getting away with murder because a lot of it you're getting back in the form of exemptions, right? So loopholes, and it's this weird thing, so you got a high rate, but the only way you get the revenue is because you give it back because of the exemptions. So what Simpson Bowles says, why don't we just rationalize all that? Why don't you make it simple? Why don't you just lower all the rates and get rid of all the exemptions? Let's do that. That'd be a pretty good idea. And in fact, people like Dave Camp, who is the outgoing chairman of the Ways and Means Committee on Capitol Hill, and Max Baucus, who is the Senate Finance Chairman, who's now the ambassador to China, they spent 3 years working on this, trying to build tax reform, because you've had about 27 years of unfettered agglomeration of all these special exemptions and all the stuff you hear about Washington. They tack it onto this bill, they tack it onto that bill, they've got a special interest here, a special interest there. When you add all that up, you get a 78,000-page tax code that is convoluted, very difficult, uncompetitive, inefficient. And we end up where we are now, where you're in a political gridlock that won't let you talk about taxes, and so you can't get to the root cause of the revenue side of this equation. Because it's one thing to talk about spending, but if you haven't figured out the revenue side, you got a real problem. So taxes is a very real issue. Well, anyway, you can say, look, thanks so much for coming. You've just depressed the hell out of me. Now I thought my future was tough already. It's even worse. So you say, well, how the hell could this be? If we actually know some of this, if there are smart people out there who are working on this thing, why can't we get to it? And this is where you come in. I'll tell you my own journey. So I'm a business guy. I'm an entrepreneur. I worked on the Hill when I was an intern at Georgetown. I worked for Congress. I was, my country. This is great. Public policy, very exciting. But I went off and built a business because that's what the American dream was all about, right? Go out and build a business, work hard, employ, compete. I'm competing in China. Like I said, 107 offices in 36 countries. I opened most of those offices. And it was exciting to be an American company, building, employing, and we're hiring, we're productive, we're paying our taxes, we're doing a good thing. But I never thought for 1 minute that I would end up in a situation where one of the things that my board would be talking about as a risk, a long-term risk for my company, would be my own fiscal situation of my United States government. I mean, that never occurred to me. I was thinking I'd be talking about China or Indonesia or, wherever, India, somebody. We spent a lot more time talking about this because you've got gridlock now. So my journey was I sit on something called the Business Roundtable. And the Business Roundtable is a bunch of business guys. So AT&T and Exxon and all these companies. So they come to Washington, they listen to meetings, they get briefed by senators, they get briefed by congressmen, we get briefed by the White House, lots of great information, and then we get right back on our airplanes and we fly off to go do what we're doing. Well, one of the guys who was sitting on our business roundtable was a guy named Dave Cody. He sat on the Simpson-Bowles Commission as a business guy. So there were a bunch of people. I think there were about 18 people in that commission. There was the so-called Gang of Six, which is Republicans and Democrats from the Senate and the Hill. Paul Ryan from the state was on that committee. There were a bunch of other people. There's labor was represented. In any event, they did a lot of really great work. But Dave Cody, who's a business guy, after sitting on that commission, he came back to our group and he said, you know what, guys? We are a huge part of the problem. Us. We fly in here, we get our briefings, we got our K Street guys down there, taking care of business on Capitol Hill, making sure we got ours, but we're not paying attention to the biggest single issue that is basically the iceberg out there that sinks the ship. This is not a small issue. And we're supposedly business leaders. We're supposed to be leaders as citizens in this country and, whatever. And why aren't we involved? Why are we not engaged? Why aren't we not owning part of this problem? Why aren't we having a voice in it? And why aren't we showing some leadership on this issue? And I tell you, that was a very sobering thing. And I think a lot of the business guys woke up and said, we are part of the problem. We've been pretty out to lunch. We're just wandering around thinking life will just go on. When in fact, one of the most serious threats, long-term threats to the viability of the greatest political experiment in history is going on right before our eyes, and we're part of the problem. We're busy just not paying attention. So I got involved in this thing, and I think that what happens is you say, gosh, once you know this, it's very hard to unknow it. So what I found in my own journey, that I couldn't unknow it enough, that I actually stepped down as my role as CEO, and I got more involved in this. And I drive the Fix the Debt people crazy because I got really involved. Now I'm in their hair all the time. But the thing is, I realized, there's an opportunity to help all of us as citizens get involved. Because what I realized, it isn't just that we know all these issues, right? There's a lot of problems and there's a lot of data about it. Then you start saying, well, if we know all this and they're smart people and you got Simpson-Bowles and all that stuff, why can't you get anything done? So let's get to this thing called the 9% approval rating of Congress. You guys vote, I hope. I don't know. You vote in primaries? Maybe it's tough to know who they are, right? So here's what's going on. There are a lot of things that make it difficult. You say, well, God, if smart people on Capitol Hill do know all this, and they actually have a way, why won't they sit down in the room? This is the business approach. Why don't you guys just sit down in a room and get it fixed? And then the politicians sort of quietly take you aside and say, look, Junior, that may work in the business world when you're the CEO and you say, okay, everybody in the room, and we're not leaving this room until we make a decision. Boom. Boy, what a luxury that is. But when you work on Capitol Hill, and you start straying too far off the rigid orthodoxy of whatever the ideological message is right now, that puts you in a vulnerable position. Because what's the rule one of elected politics? You got to get reelected, right? You got to come back. So if you stray too far from the rigid orthodoxy, you're going to get targeted. And when you get targeted, that means it's very difficult to defend yourself because they don't want to hear that you were doing the right thing, that you were courageous, that you stood up to do something good for the country. They're going to beat you to death in a primary with a whole lot of money. So some of what makes it difficult right now is we live in sort of a new political reality. I often get asked in meetings like this, back in the days of Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill, these great figures, they used to shake hands, cut the deals, everything got done. We had peace in the kingdom. It seemed productive. Why aren't we like that today? Well, John Boehner doesn't have that power anymore. He cannot run the party the way that Tip O'Neill used to run the party when he was Speaker of the House. Because we now have so much diffusion of the power. So in the name of reform, we began to change the political parties. We changed the ways they raised money. We changed the way they donated money. But in the old days, if Tip O'Neill wanted to do something really difficult that was going to be hard, and it was going to be a very hard vote for somebody to take, he could create cover for that person, but he also had the power to say, you better do that difficult thing or I'm going to make your life really miserable. In fact, I'll take you off that committee. You'll be parking 10 miles away. You'll be on the dog catcher committee. And by the way, I control the money of the party, so you won't get reelected. So you better do this difficult vote that fixes the long-term well-being of the country. If John Boehner does that today, he does not have that power. Because the money is raised by Grover Norquist, Club for Growth, David Koch, the AARP, all sorts of people raise money now in politics. And with Citizens United, It made it essentially a free ride, right? So anybody can go out and raise $100 million, and it has nothing to do with party discipline. It has to do with funding ideology. And where does that take place? In the primaries. Who shows up in the primaries? About 4 or 5% of the eligible voters. And when they get to the general election, which by this time has been gerrymandered, you've heard that word, so people spend a lot of money politically organizing how these districts get laid out. If anybody's looked at a political district map, it looks like a jigsaw puzzle, right? I mean, look at Florida, where I live. You got Fort Myers coming down across the state down into Palm Beach. Okay, well, what kind of a crazy district is that? But that was all designed to make sure that if you finally got to the general election, you were pretty much safe, which is why you don't see a lot of turnover among incumbents, right? So then the question is, who gets to the safe seat? Because if you can get to the safe seat, you don't have to worry so much about the other side. It's all in the primary. Now, who controls the primary? The more extreme views, which has meant you've now got a highly toxic, much more polarized environment in Washington, which makes it very difficult for people to say, why don't we stand up and do the right thing for these long-term discal issues? Because all of you know that you've heard it from both sides. You live in a Fox, CNN news world, right? 24-hour media, everybody's about gotcha. It's all about did you stray from the party line? And that makes it very difficult for people to have political courage, right? Because on the one hand, if you're fixed to debt, like we are, you get one extreme. There's Paul Krugman of the New York Times. We're going to throw grandma into the snow. You know, we can grow our way out of this mess. It's just about productivity, tax the rich, and we'll all be good. Okay, that's one view. At the other end of the spectrum, we're getting the hell beat out of us because we should starve the beast. It's this relentless, omnivorous government that is spending way too much money, and just starve everything and get rid of it and cut it all. Okay, I mean, I guess we could have no government. So the point is that controls the dialogue, right? But most of the world is in the middle. Most of the world is saying, you know what, you guys were sent to Washington to be adults to get this stuff done, and you're not doing it. All I see is gridlock. Do we have an energy policy now? No. Immigration policy? How'd that work out? Not very well. Infrastructure? Any been on a broken bridge recently in the Midwest? Minneapolis had one, I think, a couple years ago, fell down, right? That's something we should be doing. Do we do that now? No. Can you get to it? No. Why not? Because it's frozen. Because if you start straying too far out over the party line, whether it's those kinds of issues or issues like the iceberg that takes down the whole economy, you have a lot of difficulty. So the question then say, all right, well, that's not very good news either. Hubert Humphrey, some of you may know that name. He was a famous Minnesota politician back in the 60s. He actually ran for president against Richard Nixon, if you can believe that. But Hubert Humphrey used to say that Washington is 26 square miles surrounded by reality. You're the reality outside of Washington. This is the reality. You have real lives, real school loans, real bills, real credit card debt, real mortgages you're trying to get, and all that nonsense is sort of ground to a halt. These issues are real, they're serious, and they do affect your future. They affect all of our future. And the question is, what can you do today? Part of why we're here is at fixthedebt.org. You can actually sign up, and you can learn a lot about this issue, because it is your future. You can certainly learn enough to ask the next congressperson that you talk to what they're going to do about it. And our whole objective is, do we think there's some magic answer, that there's a silver bullet, that we're going to pull out our magic wand? No. There is no such thing. It's hard work. It takes a lot of work. But it takes a national conversation that does not diminish the conversation with a lot of finger pointing and insulting and this false choice that we're given. Has anybody in this room is anybody married in this room? A few people. Have you ever compromised with your spouse? Ever? Try not to, he says. Yeah. Good ideology. There we go. So, the real world, you compromise with your professor. I had a problem with homework. Could you just give me one day? You compromise. With your vendor, with your customer, with your suppliers, with your teachers, with your spouses. Most of us live in a world where that's the reality of the world, right? You're working things out to get along because we pretty much want to get there. And if your next door neighbor is a Republican or Democrat, you don't usually slam the door in their face and not take their kids to school. So you help them out if they got a jam, right? My babysitter left. Most of us live in that real world. But we don't live in that world in Washington. That different reality inside the 26 square miles is very toxic, and people don't do that. So you have the power to make it an issue. Look, it's interesting. You guys are a younger generation than me, and you understand Twitter and Facebook and stuff that I sure don't understand. But look, Twitter started a revolution in Egypt, and we can't fix our national debt. I mean, are you kidding me? We've got the intellectual tools and the innovation and the power you guys are holding, so the Prometheus fire, right? Because our generation screwed it up. The younger people, I think, have got a lot more power in this game than you think, and you're not even at the table. You're not even invited to the conversation, right? Because who's thinking about the debt that we're leaving you, right? It is a generational inequality thing, right? We're leaving you a huge mess. But you don't have a voice at the table. You could have a voice at the table. It is one of the most underrepresented parts of the political spectrum, and you should be asking that question. And it doesn't mean that there's any one single easy answer. It's not. It's difficult, but there's a lot of knowledge out there. The issue is we got to get out of this extremism. We got to get back to the compromise. You can't punish people for having the courage to want to actually have a conversation, which is what's happening today. So I would say that the debt is the iceberg looming out there that is the ship of state. That's what takes down the greatest political experiment in history. And all the immigration and energy policy and R&D and investment and education, that's the deck chairs. We won't have any of that stuff. That's the luxury of a free society. It won't even be there if we don't have any fiscal thing. You know, look what happened in Greece. People say, it's Greece, small country. It never happened to us. Look what's happening in Ukraine. Believe me, it can happen. And we're the biggest economy in the world. So we don't want to be in that position. We do have the ability to not be in that position, and you can change those curves by doing stuff now. And it isn't, as Paul Krugman says, about throwing grandma in the snow and slamming on the brakes and massive austerity and everybody gets, that's not what this is about. All Simpson Bowles was about is how do you do a careful job over the next 10 years of incrementally making small tweaks and changes that allow you to change that trajectory so that in the long run, that wave that hits Thailand is not as big a wave. We can begin to lower the density of that wave so we don't wipe out Thailand with a tsunami. That's a little bit what this is about, and that's how to think about it. So I would encourage all of you to just think about that in your lives. You are an underrepresented part of our political spectrum. You are people who are students, and you have a right to be angry. If I were you, I'd be really pissed off. I'd be really upset at what this generation has sort of done and said, well, tag, you're it. We didn't tell you why or how. We just did it, right? How did it happen? Lots of things. I mean, yeah, we had tax cuts, we had wars, we had a recession. Lots of stuff caused the debt. And longer term, we got an aging demographic. You know, we've got interest that's growing. Those are things that are a longer term cause of the stuff. But they are not irreversible. That's the thing that's so sad. So it's one of these weird things where we actually know how to fix it, but we can't get to it because we're politically locked in this ridiculous internecine warfare. And I don't care where you are on the political spectrum. It does not matter to me. It's completely incidental. This is not a partisan issue. It's a citizenship issue. Do we have the right as citizens to take this great and very precious experiment? And believe me, those 107 offices, I've lived all over the world. There is nothing like this country. It's an extraordinary country. It is an amazing place. It is a crucible of innovation to this day. And all the stuff you heard about China and India and all that, not even close. This is an amazing place, and there's nothing like it. But we're screwing it up. China didn't do this to us. India didn't do it to us. Putin didn't do this to us. We're doing it to us. That's the saddest part of all. And everywhere I travel, when I go to see high-ranking officials in Japan, they're all looking at me like, what is wrong with you people? You guys got it made. You're the greatest country in the world, and you can't even have a meeting in Washington to solve the most fundamental basic stuff. How do you respond to that? So the whole world is watching this and saying, my God, is this the end of the truly greatest political experiment? Can it really be that dysfunctional? Unfortunately, right now it is. So I would say you have a right to be mad. You have an incentive to be engaged. We need your help, I will tell you that. And you don't have to go run for Senate or be a Supreme Court judge to do this. You can sign up. You can get involved. You can get informed. You can send a Twitter to your congressional office today. Send it today. This is an election season. Show up and vote. Ask the question. You have a right. It's your country. So I see this as a little bit of like Dorothy, click your heels. Anybody see The Wizard of Oz? Everybody must know. Okay. Well, okay. The brain, the heart, and the courage. There's no little man behind the curtain that's going to give us the brain, the heart, and the courage to do this. We own this. And the thing is, here's the hard part of it. It's the same way that I came on this journey as a business guy. I was part of the problem. So it's like the AA, step one. Hi, I'm a recovering CEO. You have to sort of admit your problem, right? Well, we're all part of this. Boris Pasternak, he wrote Dr. Zhivago. It's a great story. Many of you have seen the movie, but he's a wonderful poet. But in Dr. Zhivago, in the original, he says, there's a quote that I love, our sin is our toleration. And probably the greatest sin we commit as a country is our toleration. We sit and watch something that we have the power to change, and we just watch it happen. I couldn't do it anymore. And that doesn't mean that I've got some magic answer, that I'm anybody special. Rachel knows I'm just some guy who showed up and said, I'll volunteer, I'll do this. I think we all have to have our journey. And it doesn't mean everybody's going to run out in the hall with a bunch of placards, right? But you have an impact. You do have power. You are Dorothy wearing the ruby slippers. You can go home anytime you want. There is no little man behind the curtain that's getting this right. There's no wizard. It's ours. It's us. We got to do it. And that's tough. But I would say, I would ask all of you, please, to at least think about it. Just give it half a thought. And on that note, I'll open it up for Q&A. I've beat them into mute. Questions, Q&A. Brad? Anybody? Okay, a brave soul in the back.
So what are you suggesting we do then? As far as, from what I understand, basically the politicians in Washington, they're not going to do anything either because they're going to get reprimanded or, you know, whatever their reasoning is. So are you basically saying to vote? And if we vote, what's to say the people we vote for are going to be any different?
Right, so there's a school of thought, that's a great question. Thank you very much for asking it. There's a school of thought that says, here's the problem today. It used to be, you don't like the bums, throw out the bums and send new bums, right? And they'll do it. The problem is the new bums, and Rachel and I were just having this conversation driving over here. The problem is the new people, the minute they get in, they got the same 15 people lined upside their door who hold all the checks. NRA, Coke, Club for blah, blah, blah. And they're all lined up saying, don't even think about it, Junior. Glad that you're new in town, but this is how it works. Don't you dare stray off the reservation. So to that point, how do you give courage? There are a couple of ways to do it. Longer term, there are issues like open primaries. So look at Washington State. Washington State now has had open primaries, which by that I mean it's a crossover. It isn't one party or the other. They actually have a crossover. And what that did was it meant people running in the primaries could no longer just cater to one extreme or the other. They actually had to get moderate enough to bring people over and cross over so that you could create a runoff between the top two. That was fairly successful in Washington. Arnold Schwarzenegger, when he was governor of California before Jerry Brown, liked that idea. He tried to do it and he got shot down and he was sued by, guess who? The Republicans and the Democrats. They didn't want anything to do with this. They sued him and it went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court upheld it, saying they can sue you there. And the argument was they're private clubs. You can't exclude. So Schwarzenegger said, well, how do I change that? He said, you got to have a state referendum and have a constitutional overthrow. Well, there was no money. The state's bankrupt. So he raised the money privately. Kevin Costner, Jay Leno, all his buddies raised the money privately, and they funded a referendum which won by 78%. And now California has open primaries. And I saw Jerry Brown in California in February, and I asked him, has this helped you get to some more rational conversation? Yes, it's been a huge impact. Now, this is going on around the country. You've got, we just talked today, this woman, Sarah, comes from the state of Iowa, where gerrymandering doesn't happen because they've got a bipartisan panel of judicial review that does all the districting. It's a very fair thing, and it works really well. They're the only one who does it, though. Now, you have to get state for referendum. The longer-term issues is we've got some root cause structural things that we should change. The near-term issue for yourself is to have a conversation and ask the question. Now, that doesn't mean you're necessarily single-handedly going to change your congressperson's ideas about this issue, but I'll tell you, politicians are very predictable, very predictable. They have an extreme, like you talk about dog whistle ear. I mean, you know, that silent whistle that only the dog hears. What they hear better than anything else is public opinion. And if public opinion says, it is important to me that we address this issue, and I don't want to hear about all this sort of false choice, left, right, extreme, why don't we please fix it? If they hear that enough, believe me, they'll fix it. And we spend a lot of our time, Rachel has worked firsthand. She worked on the Hill. She's worked for people, and she sat in how many hundreds of hours of meetings with people on Capitol Hill? Yeah.
6 years.
Lots. A lot of time. And they're very smart. They get it. But you know what we hear back from them? We don't hear anything about this. We don't hear anything about this. They do not hear the feedback. So they know it's a real issue. But if they say, you know what, we're going to reform Social Security, 10 minutes later, there's a postcard in their mailbox that says, you're throwing grandma into the snow, you're affecting the most vulnerable, you terrible person, you. How could you do that to our most vulnerable? It's not a true statement, but that's not how politics works. So you, as an individual, and every individual in this room, has the ability, A, to get informed, right? That's why you're here, you're learning. Get informed about this issue, and to be knowledgeable about it, and you can either Twitter, or email, or write, or call your elected representatives, and believe me, if they hear it, they will respond. They really do. That is a true thing. Believe me, Twitter trending is a big deal on the Hill, right? Am I right? I mean, we almost went to war in Syria on Twitter trends. You think I'm joking. And you know what's a trend in a congressional office? Get this, and I know there's a lot more than 10 of you in this room. 10 Twitters in a congressional office is a trend. Yeah, that gets reported up the ladder. Uh-oh, 10 strange people, not the bag of mail from the union that says, please vote for HR 163, and they get 10,000 postcards dumped. That is an organized campaign by an interest group. Individuals, people who are normal human beings out there who are really living their lives, when they start sending stuff in, that's what gets attention. That's what gets them nervous. And so I would divide up in groups of 10, pick a congressperson and start sending Twitters. You can do that tonight. And I know it sounds, you're like saying, well, yeah, but is that really going to fix this $12 trillion, zillion dollar Godzilla of a problem? No, it doesn't fix it tomorrow. But I'll tell you what, it is part of getting engaged in the process because it ain't going to get fixed right now. That's for sure. We tried it. I mean, look, I was there for the grand bargain. We almost defaulted on the full faith and credit of the United States of America because we had a stupid political fight going on in Washington. The business guys couldn't believe it. That's insane. It's utterly insane. And we almost did it. So that got us engaged. I'll tell you, that scared the hell out of us. That's just reckless in the extreme. So I would say, though, that it's a more insidious problem. It speaks to our roles as citizens. I think we're sort of redefining our roles as citizens. How do we engage? But your question is very poignant because it doesn't mean you have to drop everything you're doing, drop out of school, and go run a revolution in Wisconsin. What I really want you to do is get through school, get a job, have half a chance to succeed, and do what you're supposed to do in your life. But even as a citizen, you can have an impact on this conversation. And if we create a larger national dialogue about this issue, we have 23 state organizations and we've got representatives in 50 states. We have a very robust website that has a lot of information on this. It is a bipartisan group. It is all driven by the Congressional Budget Office. The research is very clear. Both sides use it. They just don't want to talk about it politically. So I know that's not an easy answer for you, but you can go on fixthedebt.org right now and sign up. And I'll tell you, there are 360,000 members signed up to fix the debt. If that was 4,600,000, that gets a lot of attention on Capitol Hill. Huge, huge, huge attention. They don't think we care about it. And your generation, more than anybody in the world, should be caring about this. So anyway, it's not an easy answer. It's not a one, here, just do this and done. We live in I had a friend at Georgetown. He used to say, we live in the world of cheap clarity. You have a rock concert, give a Visa card, $25, and we solved AIDS. I don't think so. It's a little more complicated. This one isn't going to get fixed quickly. It took us 50 years to get into this mess. It's a long time to get here. But it doesn't mean it's insurmountable, and the option, if we don't do it, the consequences are very high. So that was a long answer, but a key question. Others? Yes, over here, Professor.
When we look at the current strategy, this is like a 10 or 15-year strategy. It seems to be to limit our prosperity. And then on the second side of that, you and, say, the Fortune 500 CEOs can bring far more pressure than a classroom of people here in Pewaukee, Wisconsin. And what's happening on that level with your peers?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So Dave Cote came back and said, hey guys, we're totally out to lunch. That got a bunch of our attention. And to the credit of Maya McGinnis, who's the president of Fix the Debt, Maya's a policy person. She's not a political agitator. She was not a campaign runner. She wasn't anything. She came out of Brookings and had spent a lot of time studying why the debt was a problem. So she just knew a lot about the issue. But when Erskine and Allen realized that the president, and there were a lot of reasons why, pro and con, but there are a lot of reasons why he did not get behind the Simpson-Bowles issue. A lot of it had to do with the calculus around the negotiation with Boehner, which was a complete unknown because of the 2010 elections. And they didn't know what was going to happen, so they waited. But what Erskine and Allen said was, okay, we aren't waiting. We're going to go run a campaign. So what that campaign did was it went out and it first went to the business community, because in the old days of the Tip O'Neills and Ronald Reagans, the way this would work is Bob Rubin, this names may mean nothing to you, but I'm sure Bob Rubin, who was Secretary of Treasury, he could call up Jim Baker, who was the Chief of Staff, and he'd say, look, Jim, Rubin was a Democrat, Baker was a Republican. This is pretty important. We got to get this done. And we're all going to get a bunch of heat for it. And it's a difficult one to do, but we got to do it. So let's get together. So he would say, okay, I'll get Bob Strauss on the Democratic side. You get George Shultz on the Republican side. We'll write a couple of op-ed pieces in the Wall Street Journal and New York Times. We'll get a People on the Hill. We'll do a press release. We'll get the votes. We'll get the cover. We'll do it. That's how it was done. Now, fast forward to today when you've got anarchy in the political process. You don't have that discipline. It's much more difficult. Maya got 180 business leaders in this country from the Fortune 500 to come together, donate money, spend time, get educated, give talks, go out and do media all over the country. They all stood up. Jeff Immelt from GE, Dave Cote all stood up and said, I'll give up all the tax exemptions, just fix the damn thing. The country's at stake. This is crazy. It's not about my 13% consolidated rate. Just fix the fundamental issue. Let's do it right. I sat in a room with Fred Smith from FedEx yelling at Dave Camp and Max Baucus saying, will you guys just fix this? You're costing me more in productivity by all this dithering around than anything I would ever lose in the exemptions. Just fix it. We brought lots of pressure. But now it's very interesting. Here's the funny world about anarchy in politics. The Tea Party saw us as sellouts. You're all those corrupt business guys who've just sold out. You don't believe in Main Street, right? You don't care anymore. You're just on the corporate, you're just part of the government problem. So that didn't work. So there was a whole contingent of the party that said, well, we couldn't care less that you think that, right? Then you can imagine what was happening on the left. Well, how could we ever trust them? So you get both sides, right? So there were 180 business leaders who got involved, and I can tell you, I've been in business for a long time. You can't get 180 business leaders in a room to do anything at all, let alone join a campaign. And she did. She did. She got that done. That was unbelievable. And they gave enormous resources to this campaign. They gave marketing support and campaign support and information support, and they funded research, and they did all sorts of stuff. They did a really good job. She also got 150 former members of Congress, 50-50, split down the middle. These are people who used to work on the Hill and know all of the political constraints, and got them to weigh in. They got 2,500 major economists all over the country to write letters. And the net result was the meltdown. And that's when Fix the Debt as a campaign began to realize, and Concord Coalition's gone through this too, you realize it wasn't enough to be right. So you'd say, what's missing? What's interesting is there's inside baseball and outside baseball. Back to Hubert Humphrey, the 26 square miles surrounded by reality. That reality needs to hear from this reality. They hear from that reality all the time, and they all talk to themselves. Out here, they're not hearing it. That is the funny difference. In the old days, the inside baseball could fix the issue. You lined up enough support, I got the juice, okay, electrocute a few people and get it done. And you take the heat and a few people get burned, but okay. And think about it. Remember earmarks? You've heard a lot about this thing in politics called earmarks. Earmarks was what people like Tip O'Neill used to make you feel good. If you were a Democrat and you had to vote for entitlement reform and you were going to get attacked in your political campaign, you're going to take the heat because it's really important to do this, but you're going to get a new museum in your district. We don't do that anymore. So now the guy says, okay, I'm out here on a limb. I'm doing this thing. I got a guy spending $5 million against me in the primary, telling me that I'm going to throw grandma in the snow. I mean, how ironic is this? I'll just give you an example we were just talking about today. Kay Hagan is running for Senate in North Carolina. And this is not a political thing. It's just a factual idea. She happens to be running as a Democrat in a very tight race. But she got attacked as a Democrat for actually supporting Simpson Bowles because it supported entitlements, and Republicans are attacking her for doing entitlement reform. I mean, it's like, man, this is like Alice in Wonderland, right? I mean, this is crazy. So this is just how bad the fight's gotten, and it's very difficult. So I would say the real fight is out in the 299 million other people who don't live in Washington, who should be angry. And look at voter turnouts, low. Look at primary turnouts, very low. Where's the money being spent? Primaries. And we're not doing anything. Where's the political courage there? Not. Now, Saxby Chambliss, who's a conservative Republican from Georgia, stood up and said, we need to do revenue reform. We have to have tax reform. Well, that was not very popular when Grover Norquist was raising money to beat people for taking the pledge. Don't raise taxes. So there are courageous people out there. They need support. Some of them are leaving. Kent Conrad, who was the chairman of the Budget Committee, one of the Gang of Six, left. Saxby Chambliss, not running again. They're leaving because they're frustrated because they're not hearing from us. So I would say that it's tough to have courage if nobody's going to show up and help you. And that's what's happening. So it's a sad testimony to where we are politically, but I would say that's why this is a citizenship issue. It's not Republican, Democrat. It's not left, right. It's not Fox, CNN. This is about our country. It's like it's the whole viability of the system. And we should be teaching the curriculum. Do you think, I mean, it's funny, I gave a talk to Rachel will laugh, they were all laughing at Fix the Debt. Paul Stebbins, who barely a government major at Georgetown, lectured the American Accounting Association. I mean, that was funny. My wife is an accountant. She couldn't believe it. She thought that was surreal. But why aren't, so one of the things that came out of it was they're actually trying to develop a national curriculum on this. Wouldn't that be interesting? Now, that's not going to solve it today in Washington, but what if that just becomes an important part of accounting curriculum across the country? That would be great. So we're trying to do that. In fact, Rachel's been one of the leaders on developing the curriculum. And we're doing that in a couple of test cases. I don't know how many now, but we've got a bunch. You've got the California Stampers doing it, and Utah.
Virginia.
Yeah, so these are the longer term sort of root cause things, but anyway, yeah, we've tried. Believe me, we're trying. And the business, they didn't go away. But business people are busy, so they're saying, all right, so when's the next big fight? I'll be there. I'll show up. And that's amazing. Maya's got the ability to make one phone call, and she can get that 180 to do a lot. And they have done a lot, but it shows you how difficult it is. Long answer, but anyway. More questions out there. Oh, one over here. Yes.
In Washington that are not talking about reforms of tax and the medical system and all of these important things. What exactly are they doing from 9 to 5 every day?
Yeah, so Rachel could give you a real firsthand answer to that, but my perception, sadly enough, is they spend an enormous amount of time thinking about how they're going to beat the brains in of the other side. So the calculus is about winning and losing. It's how does Karl Rove's Political Action Committee embarrass Kay Hagan in a political race because the Senate race is very close and it might go Republican, it might go Democrat. So there's a lot at stake, so they're worried about that. That's what they're fighting about. Now, that sounds like incredibly cynical and difficult, but that is reality. And the thing is, if people were screaming at the top of lungs saying this is outrageous, why are you not dealing with this, and there was a groundswell, they would respond. They're not hearing it. So they're not doing it. Look, I mean, so immigration is supposed to be like a no-brainer. Like we're all going to get killed, dead. Gun control, look how far that goes. I mean, now I don't care where you are on these issues. The fact that any conversation got killed, it just went away. You can't get it through. They don't want to hear about that. So the calculus is about how do you raise money to go get the other guy out, because then when I'm in power, I lived through the ACA. It was a vision. I'm a business guy. Well, the ACA, all employers will tell you that healthcare is the single biggest cost driver in the country. For business, it's a huge expense, and it's not good long-term for productivity. We had to fix it. Everybody knew you had to fix it. But I don't know whether any of you guys were around when Hillary Clinton tried to do this when she was First Lady. She tried to do healthcare and got disintegrated. I mean, she got absolutely evaporated off the planet Earth for bringing up healthcare. Just there's a grease spot she got killed. I mean, it was over, right? Don't even think about it, because it's the third rail. And when President Obama came in, Rahm Emanuel told him, don't touch this issue. There's no winning this issue. You will lose the midterm elections. Guess what? He did. That's the calculus that they think about. It's really discouraging because they don't hear enough from us about this. Yes. Yes, that happens to be the truth. Now, I know I sound like the ultimate cynic on earth. There are some very good people up there, to be fair, and I have been in meetings with them. So it would be disingenuous for me to say that some of these people that I've spent hours with are not trying really hard to build consensus. Part of it is that it's very difficult to do in a 24-hour media cycle, and they can't do anything privately because everybody's trying to find out what they said so they can embarrass them and get it on YouTube and beat them in the campaign. So if Mark Warner is in a private meeting with the other side trying to get to that compromise, it's very difficult, and he ventures a little off the orthodoxy. There's a whole group of people that would love to embarrass him with that and put it on YouTube and beat him in the Virginia election. So it makes it hard. So there are great people up there who are trying to do good things, but boy, I'll tell you, that is not what the leadership is driving, because it's the political calculus. They're counting heads. How many are going to be here after the midterms? And who shows up? And so they're betting on us not showing up. I mean, this is our system at work, and it's interesting. It's a pure system. You have the absolute right not to show up. Nobody tells you got to vote. Nobody says you got to be involved. Nobody says you even have to be informed. But there are consequences. I'm talking about me too, not you. I'm talking about me too. There are consequences. So it's a tough reality. Yeah.
As like a student, obviously, like living this right now, I feel like it's kind of like we feel the same way that the courageous people feel. Like I personally,
Which people? Sorry.
The courageous.
Oh yeah.
I personally just don't feel like going out to vote because I don't think it's going to do anything.
Right. So that's it. So now this is sort of like how to tear. You never go outside again. That's how they win. This is how these cynical bastards win, because we say, I don't want to validate the system anymore. I've checked out. So you disengage, and that leaves a vacuum. When in fact, if there was ever a time in our history where you should be screaming at the top of your lungs and using every social media tool in your power, I mean, Erskine Bowles is on the board of Facebook, and Erskine Bowles, who's part of Bowles Simpson, is trying really hard to use these tools to create a hell of a lot more interest in this issue, because it is sort of the issue. It's the issue of our time. But I can understand why you feel that way. Because you look at this and you think, well, what's the point? I understand. So in some ways, the loudest vote of all has been the great middle of this country that's just checked out. That's why Congress has a 9% approval rating. But I would argue now more than ever is the time to be engaged.
Like on your website, on the Fix the Debt website, is there a way to connect people
Yes.
who feel like down with the courageous people?
Yes, 100%. They have done amazing work, amazing work, amazing work. There's a lot there. And look, you don't need everybody. You just need some, right? We don't need 100 votes in the Senate. I need 60. You don't need 435 in the House. You need 219. I mean, Jim Baker, who was President Reagan's chief of staff, they had one of the most successful legislative agendas in history, whether you like Reagan, it doesn't matter. But the reason is, they said, Jim Baker, what's your secret? He said, 50% plus one. You negotiate until, because once you cross that, then you have no deal. I'll take any deal, it's better than no deal. So that's the strategy. That's not what we have today. As Bill, I was at a talk recently, Bill Clinton said a very interesting thing. He said, we used to run the political world in the fight for philosophy. Now it's the fight of ideology. Those are very different things. Philosophy is Madison and Hamilton could fight it out at the Constitutional Convention and come to a compromise about what would govern this great experiment. Ideology is, I don't care what the facts are, this is what I believe. Right now, it's being driven more by ideology. And look, we've all read a lot about ideology in the last, anybody who's read a newspaper article about ISIL, that's what ideology does. They don't care about facts. This is deep, it's completely irrational. Well, unfortunately, that's driving some of the political engine right now, and that's unfortunate. So we've so diminished our national conversation. I mean, what an incredible, sad tribute that this is what passes for civil discourse. We should not tolerate it. Certainly not this generation. So we're trying, the business guy, I mean, I tell you, there are more engaged business people than I've ever seen in my life on this. And I don't mean political action committee stuff. I mean really engaged in the issue. And that's positive. So, but it's not a silver bullet. This will get solved outside of Washington, not inside. I'm sorry?
Crisis?
Well, I mean, I'm an optimist. I'm a business guy who thinks, okay, how does one avoid crisis? I would like to think that. I would argue we're in the crisis. This trajectory we are on is real. And unless you change it, it's not going to change. This is an opinion. It's not, I believe one thing, and this isn't Fox CNN. This is just what it is. That's what happens to the math. There are more people getting older. Guess what? They're going to be in Social Security. Guess what? It's bankrupt. I mean, okay, I didn't make it up. It's not political. It's not Republican or Democrat. That's just a fact. And here's the bad part. They all know it. Every one of them knows it. But who's going to take the heat at the poll to do that? Not unless we get behind them and say, I don't give a damn, you better do it. Because it's my future you're screwing with. Until we do that, then they won't. So, in that sense, I'm an optimist. You have much more power than you think. And you're right at the heart of it. What the hell are they talking about if they aren't talking about this? You're right. Yes?
So, are you saying in order to get things moving forward, is the first step for our generation to start building awareness on social media? You keep mentioning Twitter and everything like that. Is that?
It's not the only thing. There are many things going on contemporaneously, and Rachel could spend another hour telling you about the amazing number of things that Fix the Debt as an organization has done. And we're not advocating an outcome on the plan. We're not the ones saying, well, it should be this kind of a tax tweak and that kind of an entitlement. That's not what Fix the Debt. Our whole job is, if we aren't having the national conversation, shame on us. So this has turned into a campaign to broaden the national conversation outside of all the people who think they own the decision. So Twitter is a piece of it. It's not the only thing, but is it a start? Sure, because you have the ability to communicate in ways that my generation had no clue. It just had no clue, didn't even enter their mind. And that is just a way of getting engaged. I'm sorry, there's a hand in the back. Yes.
Yes, I noticed that with Congress and they have so much power that they're exceeding their powers. Is how can we, with them being the lawmakers, how can we enforce a term limit and the lobbyists capping the money that they're allowed to get?
Great. So that's a very good question because it leads to a bunch of other structural issues. So what are campaign finance issues? What about the money? What about transparency? Are lobbyists registered? How much do they spend? What's the influence? What are the relationships? Those are lots of issues. And you can imagine on the Hill, there's a lot of stuff that goes on to make sure that that's not transparent. Now, here's an irony. I'll throw you out sort of a contrarian thought. And this, I don't, it's just a view. But term limits is an interesting one because a lot of stuff was done in the name of reform. Like, for example, term limits. When I worked on Capitol Hill, interestingly enough, institutional history was highly valued. I worked for a young guy from Colorado, and I asked him who he thought was the most important congressman in the House, and he said Dick Bowling. Now, he didn't say Ted Kennedy or he didn't say somebody that I knew. He said somebody I've never heard of in my life. And Dick Bowling had for 30 years been running the Rules Committee. And the Rules Committee is what arbitrates the terms of debate in the House about legislation. And it has to be fair. Everybody's got to have a chance to debate it. And Dick, who happened to be an old agricultural Democrat from Missouri, was absolutely respected. He had deep institutional knowledge. He'd been there 30 years, and I'm telling you, everybody respected that guy. Now, what happens with term limits, which was throw out the drunk old jerks who are sort of running the committees and are too idiotic to do anything, throw them all out and make sure they can never stay longer than X. This was a little bit of, we had a solution, but what you lost also was all of the institutional history. So now the average term, 55% of the House has been there 3 years or less. Okay, people, they've never written a bill in their life. They don't know anything about it. And by the way, they came with an ideological bent. They didn't come as legislators. So legislating is actually a craft. So when you hear about the days of Bob Dole and George Mitchell and Ronald Reagan, these were people who were professional litigators. And they came up from a World War II generation that didn't just think government was bad by definition. They were veterans. So they got things done. And it was all about getting things done. Ultimately, the higher duty of care was to get something done. But what changed this partly is the party losing its power. You have the money issue, the lobbying, and interestingly enough, transparency hurt because it used to be the subcommittees were closed. So you could actually do deals that were very difficult for you to do in your district, but you could get something done. And it never got public. Now, everything is public. It's on YouTube in 10 minutes. So very hard to get stuff done. So it's ironic. The reforms actually caused part of the problem. So whatever. I throw that out to you for consideration. You can change that too. Oh, yeah.
All right. I always wondered, just interested in the numbers. For instance, the money that's being taken in and where it's being spent. Not just like, okay, the military, $550 billion. To say, where is it going in the military? And if you put more numbers out and generalize it to younger people so they can see how astronomical the spending is, couldn't that change views and get more people talking about it to support what you want?
Yes. Revenue and spending. There it is. That's where it goes. That's the budget right there. So you got Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, other mandatory. Which that's all of our education, infrastructure, all the other stuff. But all this stuff is growing so fast that you're crowding that out. And there's your 6% interest. That's where the money goes. And within this is all the stuff you hear, Head Start, programs, all the stuff we hear about. That's in there. That's in the 16. But that's still discretionary. Military is discretionary. You can actually choose not to do it. We don't choose that. But all this other stuff is growing geometrically, and that one up there is going to kill you. So that's all you're really talking about. So you're saying, where's the money go? It's tied by law to these things that unless we change it, we'll do it forever.
But when you see that, like to me, when I see that, it doesn't make that big of an impact. Now, if I seen, like for instance, Medicare, and then, I see $2 trillion going to one hospital for a reason that doesn't look very important to me, that can make a bigger difference than seeing 14% over the whole board.
So that's a great question. So I could show you, if you had, it's like this thing. If you wanted to get it, every bit of this has detail that would just numb your brain. Yeah. The problem is we tend to get politicized in the sense that one easy answer is that it's waste, fraud, and abuse. If all those stupid hospitals that overcharge, Dr. So-and-so, who we just arrested for $1 million fraud, right? Or Nancy Pelosi's private jet, she's flying around, that's what it sort of turns into. The problem is those are very small numbers in the relative scheme. The great vast majority of it is just perfectly legitimate stuff that's plowing along. It's just not well structured, right? And so, for example, in the president's budget, change CPI is the indexing on how you calculate Social Security. And all he did was say, I just want to change the index so that it's more like the rest of the cost of living. Got blown out of the water politically. by the progressives. And the Democrats were so ticked off at him that they made him take it out. So the last budget is out. I mean, it's a political issue. It's not, do you know how to do it? So there's lots of rationale. And what breaks your heart is we know the answers. They're there. I mean, here's a sad thing, and Rachel's boss, Maya, knows this. I mean, the deal between Boehner and Obama was so close. And you would have struck. So here's the issue. People say, well, how much would it actually take to so what, if you could snap your fingers, Paul, what would you do? I need $2.5 trillion. When Bowles-Simpson came out, they said we need about 4. By the time they'd actually announced it and debated it for 8 months, they needed 5. Between spending and revenue, you needed $5 trillion from somewhere, either by cutting or getting new revenue. You needed $5 trillion to stabilize this thing and actually keep it from doing this geometric curve to something that you saw on this chart. To get that stabilized and have it to start flatten out, you needed about $5 trillion all in. Now, we've made some progress. We did have the Budget Control Act. We had the American Taxpayer Relief Act. We had some stuff done, which brought it down. To close the gap today in what we would consider enough money to just simply stop the curve is about $2.5 trillion over 10 years. And you need tax reform, some revenue to do that, and you need some spending cuts. You would need to do change CPI. You need to do means testing in Medicare. There's a whole, there are pages of this stuff. And you can do it. But there's a political cost to doing it. That's why it didn't get done. Very tough. You have power. You actually have power. Believe it or not, you have power. You don't feel like it, but you do. So, but it's a great question. It's all there. The detail is there. And it's funny. There's no sort of magic to it. And what's amazing is you look at this stuff, people say, really? Is this really what we're talking about? So, but, that's what it looks like. These things are killing us, And, that's your growth. That's healthcare by GDP, right? There's good old U.S. up there. That's healthcare expense for us. You think you're getting great healthcare compared to Sweden or Switzerland? I don't think so, right? That's who's paying in. There it is. You can get all this on the website. There's your average age of retirement and what it's doing to the demographics. There's the drop off in Social Security that happens around 2035, 2033, 23% drop. For Paul Stebbins, corporate officer and inner city poor woman, get the same cut. Does that make sense? I don't think so. Right? What's wrong with us? So here's the interesting thing about tax expenditure. Here's your loopholes. If you divided this into a chart, individual loopholes. So what are they? Everybody's heard of these. Home mortgages, right? Deduction. These are not easy to get rid of. If you passed a law tomorrow that said got rid of home mortgage deduction, you'd have a friggin' revolution. But let's at least have the conversation about what it is, right? And people say, well, all those corporate guys, and I'm one of them. All those corporate guys. Here's your corporate. There's your corporate. 3%. And here's all the things that corporations deduct. Let's see. And so what we were saying, a bunch of it, get rid of all of it. Take every bit of it. Just lower the rate and make us more competitive. Because right now, the UK is 28%. The United States is 37% corporate tax rate. The UK, remember the Beatles had to leave because of 90% tax rates? The UK is more competitive than us. It's incredible. This isn't Ireland or Bermudas or Cayman Islands. And so you see all the stuff in the paper about inversions? Now, some of it's bad stuff, idiots doing stupid things. But I'll tell you what, you've also got, you think Ford Motor Company is a U.S. company? It's a global company. You're competing out there. And you think China has the same governance that we have on what they're doing? I don't think so. I've been to China. I spent a lot of time in China. It's very competitive. Anyway, that's the reality. It's all there. So why wouldn't we have that conversation? But if you're signing tax pledges, we can't talk about taxes. Well, then you're never going to have the conversation. How stupid is that? How stupid is that? So shame on us. Anyway, you have power. You really do. You can, A, get informed. You're smart. You're the future of this country. It's all there. It's available. Please help us. We're trying other stuff. Rachel's very depressed now. She's, uh-oh. She's gonna report me back to headquarters. Paul had them really dying. Anyway. It's an exciting issue, though. Look, I am at my heart an optimist. I didn't step down as CEO to do this because I'm depressed. I'm an optimist because I believe in this experiment. I worked on the Hill. When I worked on the Hill, God, I thought the congressman I worked for was the greatest person ever. Man, I want to be president of the United States, the greatest country ever. And I travel all over the world, and I've built all those offices. It is a great country. It really is. It kills me that we have the power to change this, and we aren't doing it. We aren't. This isn't Syria. This isn't, I mean, Brazil's got real problems. China's got real problems. We could fix this. And can you imagine the economic impact to the world if the front page of the United States papers all over said, grand bargain struck for long-term fiscal stability of the United States. Stable tax reform and fiscal trajectory organized. Grand bargain done between all parties. Are you kidding me? The flood of capital that would come into this country, and all of that means jobs for you, would be huge. 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 And we won't do it. Yuck. Drives me crazy. I need my medicine now, Rachel. Anyway, I'm fired up because it's important, and I think it's important for you guys, and I'm glad to be here, and I would go anywhere else in this country to talk about it because it's important. So, thanks for coming, guys. I appreciate it.